Thank you again, everyone, for attending today's webinar about how to purchase, how to leverage state cooperative purchasing to support one-to-one learning. My name is Jack Lynch, and I'll do a more detailed introduction here in a moment. I do want to apologize again. It seems like the chat feature is not working. We're trying to figure that out, but if we aren't able to figure that out, please feel free to use the Q&A function to send us any questions as we're presenting. We'll either try to respond to those questions as they come in, or we'll get to them when we have a Q&A section at the end of the meeting. I think we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Thanks, Jeff. This webinar is being presented as part of Education Superhighway's Digital Bridge K-12 initiative. Education Superhighway kicked off the Digital Bridge K-12 work a couple of months ago to help school districts and state leaders navigate the technology and infrastructure challenges associated with the shift to distance learning brought on by the coronavirus epidemic. And I encourage everyone, when you have a chance, to check out our digitalbridgek12.org website to learn more about this work. As I mentioned, my name is Jack Lynch. I'm the Director of State Engagements at Education Superhighway, and I've been leading our Digital Bridge project. This is a picture of me from when my beard was much shorter. I've been working on that during the quarantine. But I'm very excited to be joined on the webinar today by Jeff Mao from EdMoxie and Voight Sheely from NSPA. Jeff, would you like to say anything, and then Voight after that?
Sure. So hi, everybody. It's nice to be here. My name is Jeff Mao, and as Jack said, I'm with EdMoxie, which is my own small consulting firm, but probably better known in the wider world as the former Education Technology Director for the state of Maine. And as we get into the state cooperative purchasing, we'll be looking at the MLTI contract, which was something that I wrote back in 2013, but we'll get into the details on that a little later. Voight?
Thank you, Jack. Hello, everyone. My name is Voight Sheely. I'm a Cooperative Contract Coordinator 3. We just changed our title, so I'm still adjusting to it. I was formerly the Education and Outreach Director for NSPA Value Point. Before joining the NSPA Value Point team, I was a Chief Purchasing Official for the state of South Carolina, a job I held for 20 years. I was responsible for all procurement of the state of South Carolina. So I'm well aware of this cooperative solicitation. I was very excited about it when it came out.
Great, thank you, Voight and Jeff. Here's the agenda we're planning to cover today. We'll talk about the broader challenge that school districts and states are facing right now to make sure that distance learning and one-to-one learning is available for students as they need to now learn from anywhere in many situations. We'll talk specifically about state cooperative purchasing. Jeff will take us through this multi-state learning technology initiative that was really piloted and created by the state of Maine. And then we'll wrap up and talk about next steps and answer questions that come up. Okay, so for the first section, identifying the challenges, through our digital bridge work at Education Superhighway, we've been working with a number of school districts around the country in the last few months to understand better the challenges that they're facing and what the possible solutions to those challenges are. And we've boiled it down to 3 key things when we're talking about learning infrastructure for distance learning that school districts are facing. The first challenge is, which is very relevant to this webinar, is lack of devices. Many school districts have one-to-one programs already in place, but many more do not. And maybe the ones that did have never actually sent devices home with students before. So that's been a big challenge that school districts have had to navigate, both in terms of being able to procure the devices they need and also understanding how those devices need to be managed in this new environment for a lot of folks. The other challenge is on the broadband side and the connectivity side. And it's a combination of families not having access to the internet, maybe not understanding what options they have to connect to the internet, and also school districts now in many cases are taking on the burden of trying to ensure that families and homes are connected so that students can continue learning, because that's the way that education is being delivered in so many instances right now. and understanding the solutions, the service provider options related to that need has been a big struggle. And then the third category, which really underscores kind of everything else, is insufficient data. So school districts don't necessarily know which students have a gap in these areas. It's not information that they may have been collecting previously. They're working hard to try to bridge that gap, but strategies like sending a survey out have been less than desirable in many cases. And so understanding the data around this problem has been a big challenge and a big roadblock to ultimately solving it. And while we don't have granular data in a lot of cases on which students are impacted by this gap, we do have some estimates and studies that give us a sense of how many students might be impacted. And the Pew Research Center has conducted a study from about a year ago or so that estimated that a quarter of teens in households with annual incomes below $30,000 a year don't have a home computer. They don't have access to a dedicated learning device they can use to continue their educations at home. And then we can go to the next slide. Similarly, the same study found that about a third, or 35% of households with school-age children below the $30,000 annual income level don't have a high-speed internet connection at home. So those two problems, lack of a device and lack of connectivity, really are the key factors that constitute what we have previously called the homework gap, and now has really become just the learning gap in many cases, because people have been forced to learn at home. And so one of the things we've got on our Digital Bridge website is Education Superhighway's estimate of how pervasive the connectivity issue is across the country and on a state-by-state basis. Again, these are just estimates because we do have that gap of good, high-quality data collections in most places, but we estimate that over 9 million students are in this situation where they don't have internet access at home, and that's a sizable chunk of the 55 million students that in one way or another were forced to try to continue learning at home over the last few months, and may continue to have challenges here as we look towards back to school next fall. And one thing I'd like to highlight is, we think a role state leaders can play and really should help play in this whole problem is to help to do this needs assessment, help school districts to understand what the gap is that they're facing, specifically who is it impacting, and by doing that, set us up for ways to solve it. And I want to highlight that there's work being led by CCSSO right now that Education Superhighway has been participating in to help provide recommendations, processes, tools that states will be able to use to assume that role and to really provide the support and to collect the data that we need to overcome this challenge. And with that, my piece is done. So I'm going to now hand it over to Voight to talk about how state cooperative purchasing can play a role in this.
Thank you, Jack. Hello, everyone. NSPA Value Point is the purchasing cooperative of the National Association of State Procurement Officials, or NSPA. That is the association of the chief purchasing official of every state in the nation, along with the District of Columbia and the U.S. territories. Every state in the nation and the District of Columbia signed, a memorandum of agreement to create a framework, if you will, for states collaborating on common procurements. As I mentioned before, I was a chief purchasing official in South Carolina for many years, and we did hundreds of solicitations for what we call statewide term contracts. Well, guess what? Most of the states in the nation buy a lot of the same things. So NSPA Value Point offers the states an opportunity to collaborate to do single solicitations versus replicating that process across the nation time and again. Next. When states choose to work together, we facilitate that collaboration. We do no solicitations. the states do themselves. We are what we believe to be one of the true cooperatives in the nation. The states originate the ideas for the next contracts. They conduct the solicitations. We actually have states that volunteer to do the next up solicitation. It may be California one time, it may be Maine one time, it may be Utah one time, and that can change from contract to contract. The states do those solicitations. We have volunteers of procurement officers and subject matter experts from other states who work with that lead state. They work together to build a solicitation. They evaluate the proposals. They determine the awards. And then once awarded, they administer those contracts. Eligible users on our contracts, to put it simply, if you work for an organization that's eligible to purchase from your state's state term contracts, you're eligible to buy from NSPA value point contracts. That includes state government agencies, local government agencies, for you, K through 12 schools, public colleges and universities, tribal governments, and some nonprofits, but that varies from state to state. Next. So what are the benefits of cooperative purchasing? I have some certain ideas here. Let me address each one. Number one, expertise. When it comes to particularly complex solicitations, when you get into information technology and some of the other things, they're very complex solicitations to build, very complex contracts to administer. Few states can bring to bear the number of experts and with the breadth of experience that a single state can bring to bear. For example, one of our contract portfolios is cloud solutions. We actually work with a committee of 10 state chief information officers and 4 state chief procurement officers for the better part of a year to develop the scope of work. Because once we place those contracts, we needed to know that they would actually fit for the states who wanted to use them. Next advantage is market leverage. As a chief purchasing official of South Carolina, I think the last time I was there, the last year, we awarded almost $1.8 billion in contract awards that year. Well, NSPA Value Point purchases off of NSPA Value Point contracts have topped $12.3 billion annually for the last 3 years. So we have a lot of volume. Volume drives pricing. So market leverage, you've got all 50 states and the public entities within all 50 states eligible to purchase from the contracts. That gets suppliers' attention. Pricing. Generally speaking, volume drives pricing. I think that's a common, accepted, and correct norm in public purchasing. The other driver is simplicity. Suppliers love the fact that they can submit one proposal because that's expensive for them to do. It can cost tens of thousands of dollars to build a proposal. Instead of offering the same proposal time and again across the nation, they can offer it one time, gain those contracts, and then sell those contracts to eligible users. Scalability. Whether you're a small local entity, and many of you that are, you don't really have procurement professionals on staff to deal with these complex solicitations. We have entire states. You have suppliers that they can offer for the entire nation. They can offer for a region that they serve. They can even offer for a single state. And finally, speed. Now, honestly, doing a cooperative purchase for the entire nation takes longer than doing one for a single entity or even a single state. But when you consider how much time it would take every one of those states, and particularly every one of your schools, to do a competitive solicitation in accordance with your procurement requirements, compared to a single solicitation, one time, get it done, speed is a huge advantage. Next. Options for states. Under NSPA value point, again, our state chief procurement officers are our directors. They are our members. State chief procurement officers can adopt NSPA value point contracts for the entire state. When they do that, they roll those out to you as statewide term contracts. Once that's done, you just cut a purchase order like you would to buy off of any other state term contract. When that doesn't happen, chief procurement officers can authorize your district to adopt NSPA value point contracts. It's your choice. You sign up, you enter the contracts yourself. Now, you do that naturally in accordance with your own procurement requirements, whatever they may be. Once you do that, as far as NSPA value points concerned, we've already competitively competed those contracts. They've been awarded in accordance with stringent state procurement standards. So you can go to any one of our contractors and decide to use them. Or if you want to be more sophisticated about it, you can do what we call a secondary down select or a secondary solicitation to have our suppliers compete for the scope of work that you actually have available. Next.
Okay, so let me pick it up from here from Voight to kind of get into the details of the Multi-State Learning Technology Initiative contract. And so this is really, as many of you may be aware, the contracts that underpin the Maine Learning Technology Initiative, which has been in operation since 2002 in the state of Maine. And it was during the solicitation that we did in 2012, leading into the 2013 school year, when we recognized in the state of Maine that it would be advantageous, we thought, to us and to everybody else to try and make this a NSPA contract. Getting back to some of Voight's points, we knew that Maine in general was just not a big place. And so to the degree that we could try and make this contract competed across the whole country and potentially be able to leverage even larger volumes and things and get more attention from the vendors, that was some of the things that drove us to this. Also just recognizing that we thought other states might appreciate kind of the aid and the help, because I know in talking to a lot of my peers, the other education technology directors, most of them felt that they weren't really in a position to do this by themselves in their states. They didn't have the authority to get it done. And so we went ahead and took that lead. This was done then in partnership with two other states, Hawaii and Vermont. And as you can see here, there's a kind of a big long bulleted list here. So the key to this contract is this is not what we would call a commodity contract for equipment. So it's not simply give me your best price for a laptop or give me your best price for a Chromebook. This was really about establishing a service that provisioned a device for every student and guaranteed that that student would always have a working device for, and if they were ever without a working device, that wouldn't be for more than a school day. That was the basic service provision. So every student has a device, it works. And so that meant the vendors came forward with both equipment, but a huge slew of services. And so those services that included things like the technical services, so the warranty and the repairs. And this is something that we found was really critical for Maine, and I think it's probably true in every state, even states with big giant cities. You know, New York has New York City, but then I've lived in New York, and there's plenty of New York, like where I lived out in Western New York, that is very rural, just like Maine, where you could have little towns that there is no computer fix-it shop in town. So the question becomes, how do I fix this if it breaks? And so through this contract, the vendors are provisioning service that is not only simply an extended warranty that says if something breaks, it'll be covered, but if something breaks, we have a process that will get it fixed. And all of those costs related to getting it fixed under warranty are already baked into the annual cost. And so there isn't an additional payment that schools are having to make because a machine failed under warranty. So it gets picked up, it gets shipped to the repair center and shipped back to them. There's also built into this contract as an option Wi-Fi networks at this stage. And I think for the current challenges, we're really not looking at the Wi-Fi networks, although in theory, if a school needed that, there is a component there that is the Wi-Fi networks. There's teacher professional development. There was also leadership development and technical professional development. And so the key there was recognizing both the introduction of a lot of computers into the classroom space, or as we've all seen, the introduction of just remote learning and having kids on devices and at home changes a lot of things for teachers. And so they need help. But it also means there's new leadership challenges, and for the technology folks in your schools, there's new technical challenges. It may be that they're now supporting a device they've never supported before, or simply they've never dealt with this kind of volume before. And so those were all baked into the solicitation to make sure that the vendors provided that kind of training ongoing and throughout the term of the contracts. We also made sure we put into this asset management, and so that we could keep track of the devices for the state of Maine. And the way in which we instituted the program, the state was actually the purchaser of all of this. And so all the devices were actually owned and leased by the state of Maine. And so that, for us, allowed us to move devices between school systems. So in any given year, some school systems are growing and others are shrinking, and we could move devices around to make sure that everyone had the right number. Or, as you probably all know, in any given week, students are moving from one district to another. And so we often had to simply transfer a device from one town to the next town over and make sure that the technical support and kind of financial obligations connected to that device were transferring from one school's responsibility to another school's responsibility, and so on and so forth. That asset management also then provided for software deployment services so that we could do software installation over the air, right? So especially now, I think that's a particularly important piece. So devices that are now sitting resident in homes, and so I've got one here in my house. My son just finished his junior year in high school, but he's got an MLTI laptop. But if his school needed to install a piece of software, they could have done it from school or from home. The technician just needs to log in, click a button, and it could have pushed software to his device. And so they can manage all of those things. And so that allows you to manage a fleet of machines that are dispersed across a huge geography of your entire school district and in people's homes, and not necessarily in your building, where you can get your hands on them. Of course, asset tagging, things like that, just to keep track of the devices. Replacements was built in because we recognize that in a large deployment, somebody's going to drop one sooner or later. Something's going to break, and you're going to need to replace one. And we wanted to make sure that, again, sticking to the no student without a device for more than a school day, you had to have a process built in to ensure that if a student did drop a machine, or maybe it was stolen, or simply it broke for whatever reason, that there would be a replacement device quickly, and that student wouldn't be left waiting weeks for another machine, particularly when oftentimes the reason the device went, failed or was no longer available had nothing to do with the student, right? It wasn't the student's fault. There's no reason to penalize that student. And even if the student was at fault, do you want to penalize them by then withholding learning, right? The penalty doesn't fit the crime, so to speak. It doesn't make sense. So we wanted to make sure we had replacements built in. The contract also provides for project management from the vendor. So for a large statewide deployment like we did in Maine, we actually had an office in Maine that housed 13 full-time employees from Apple, who was our prime vendor. And those employees then all lived and worked in Maine, paid Maine taxes, and had kids in Maine schools. But it meant that every day, at any time, I could call them and we had support on the project level. And so they worked with us to keep track of, breakage trends and repair issues, or just simply when they might be hearing, or we might be hearing, of technical challenges or educational challenges or whatever, we could coordinate and work together. Depending on how a state might deploy that service and the size of it, you may or may not necessarily have an in-state team, but it was something that Maine put in its requirements, that we wanted to have an in-state team because we knew we were going to be statewide. And then, of course, deployment services, so that when we placed the order, literally what I did each time I pushed one of these orders, we had a big gargantuan spreadsheet that we assembled after feedback from the schools, and they're signing off on various forms and whatnot, that had one row per school with an address, numbers of devices, do you have a 53-foot loading dock so they can back up a big 18-wheeler truck and a pallet lift and whatnot. And the devices got drop shipped directly to every school. So it wasn't like they came to Augusta at the state office and somehow I had to then redistribute 80,000 computers, because that wouldn't work. So the contract itself has 3 vendors that were awarded: Apple, CTL, and HP. I think everyone's probably familiar with Apple. You're probably very familiar with HP. CTL may be a smaller player that you may not be as well versed with. They are a PC and Chromebook maker. They're in Oregon, so they're a US-based manufacturer. Or at least company. Manufacturing may still happen elsewhere. They've done, actually, I know from in working with them, they actually do a lot of work with the state of Oregon at state agency level. And so they're used to doing public deployments with public agencies like government agencies and whatnot, and have proven to be a good partner. I know that a number of other states, and I'll get into that in a moment, have actually then signed contracts with CTL to do device deployments through this contract. And so we've got then across this contract, you have Apple with obviously iPads and their MacBooks. CTL provides Chromebooks and Windows laptops, and then HP, of course, does both Chromebooks, Windows laptops, as well as they do have a tablet device, I believe still. They did in 2013. I'm assuming they still have one now. So let me run through two quick examples here. I've mentioned Maine before. Maine is obviously the larger program, and it has pre-existed for a long time, since 2002. Primarily, we deployed Apple equipment, iPads and MacBook Airs in 2013. We also had a small contingent of schools who wanted to use the HP ProBook using a Windows platform. And that program persists today, and they are, I think, entering next fall will be year 19 of one-to-one learning in the state of Maine. And so a lot of the kind of learnings of what happened in Maine is what really went into this contract. In 2015, the state of Nevada decided to use this contract, and what they did, as Voight mentioned, as one of the options was they did, I guess, what Voight called a down select, or essentially recompeted. So they asked Apple, CTL, and HP to resubmit a smaller bid proposal, because a lot of the stuff was kind of already done, but they then wrote out language that was kind of specific to Nevada and how their program was going to work, and needed answers. Well, for us, we're going to need professional development to these locations and to these numbers of schools and so on and so forth. Please respond to those pieces. And then ask for, I think, a different pricing structure, because they weren't going to do a 4-year lease. They had a different funding stream through the Nevada Ready 21 program. I think that was a 1 or 2 year appropriation. And so they had to structure the finances different. As a result of that recompete, CTL won that competition and deployed the NL6 Chromebook. I was talking with some of the folks at CTL just about 3 weeks ago, and they said that they've been in conversations with Nevada to refresh that fleet, and so they're continuing to do that work. There's 2 other states that are not highlighted here, but I'll just mention them briefly. Vermont and New Hampshire do also have contracts with CTL as essentially state master contracts. So they've, as Voight said, just simply made them state master contracts so that their districts could purchase off of them if they chose to. So if we look at this, there's basically a roadmap that we considered when we developed this contract structure for everybody, thinking about how would states get involved, because we knew that not every state, and most states, in fact, we're not going to just jump in like the state of Maine and say, oh, let's just appropriate dollars and buy these for all the schools, particularly because so many schools have pre-existing programs, and so that it just might not match up well. So we came up with these 3 tiers, and I'll start with tier 3, which is simply, effectively, tier 3 is one of those options that Voight mentioned before, which is simply, I could make this as a state master contract and allow my districts to purchase off of it, or directly just kind of make it a legal contract for districts to purchase through any numbers of kind of structures, and Voight can probably get into more details on exactly how that works, but the state doesn't really get deeply involved in the direct purchase, but they make them legal contracts and make sure that their schools are aware that this is an available contract for them. The idea was, if this was step 1, and you started to see some schools going, because it may be that a state's not in a position to start appropriating funds or really get deeply involved at this stage, that after a year or 2, you may start to see enough schools doing this. And one of the things we saw in the pricing proposals that came back to us was, of course, tier 3 pricing was higher than tier 2 pricing, which was higher than tier 1 pricing, because in tier 2, states would start stepping in and acting as a purchasing aggregator, right? So trying to say, hey, everyone, let's all put together one big order. We'll put it in together, and I'll try and coordinate that effort across all the districts. And so, of course, I'm shining a big light on this. And so the vendor said, well, if you're going to shine a big light on this and get a bigger piece of the pie, so to speak, then I'll give you a better volume discount, essentially. And so the idea was, if you had a number of districts going tier 3, and previously didn't really have the authority or the permission or kind of the willingness at various levels in the state government to be able to start really stepping in as an aggregator and to really kind of call attention to this. But then maybe you have 10 districts who do it, And then you can immediately say, well, if those 10 districts represent X numbers of thousands of kids at this many dollars per student per year, and the tier 2 pricing is even say $5 a kid less, you could do the math and say, boy, if we aggregated this purchase immediately, we see a savings, right, for our schools, in which case that becomes kind of the ammunition to say to the legislature or whomever in your state offices and your state agencies, we should be a tier 2 state. Let's move to a purchase aggregation model. And then likewise, if you can start to build volume in that way, that's what may then instill a legislature to be able to be told, look, if we move to a tier 1, meaning we start to really get involved with this, we start to actually appropriate funds for this to support our schools, we could become tier 1, and we know that we might even be able to save another $5 or $10 per student, which again, you can multiply that up and start to see a real number. And so you can see there's this kind of roadmap from going from kind of essentially a state master contract where local schools are purchasing on their own, all the way through to a program like Maine where you have state appropriations that are being used to help fund this program. And really, the state of Maine's program is actually a combination of tier 1 and tier 2. So in the state of Maine, the state pays for, from the State Department of Education, we paid for grade 7, grade 8, and all staff grades 7 through 12, all wireless networks 7 through 12. High school students were paid for by the local schools, and so we placed the order as an aggregator. So as far as the leases were concerned, it was one big giant lease. And then what I simply did when I was in the office was my team and I, we would issue invoices to the schools, and they would simply pay us back for their share. So if we knew, oh, you've got 500 machines at your school, then you owe me 500 times the seat cost for this year, and we would collect those funds back from them so that we could then make the payments back to the vendors. So again, it helped to reduce the costs even just on an administrative end, because as you can imagine, Apple was much happier having to simply ask me, hey Jeff, did you sign the invoices? Did you send the check? As opposed to chasing after in Maine, say 180 different school districts and 180 different business offices saying, did you write a check this month? And so it was much simpler than from that perspective. So that gives you kind of a sense of kind of the roadmap that you could take. You can obviously jump in at any point. But so really the next steps, and I think this is really the key, if this seems like an interesting thing for you, I'm going to turn it back to Voight if you want to kind of go again. What does a state need to do at this stage? Oops, did I just lose the slides? Oh no, okay, there we go. So Voight, can you address that?
Yeah, I'll be glad to. But first of all, hey folks, I like the fact that I'm chasing Jeff down instead of chasing all of you down, right? So, okay, you've heard this. Hopefully we've given you food for thought. What do you do next? How do you participate? We've given a website address for what we call our portfolio overview page for Learning Technology Initiative. That'll take you directly to that page of the NSPA Value Point website. Take a look, see what you think. If you find what you've heard there and what you see on our website interesting, connect. If you're interested, connect with your state chief procurement officer. Let them know. They may not be thinking this is the priority that it really is. Although I will tell you, I'm on calls with state chief procurement officers all the time, and they are well aware of how the pandemic has affected our lives. And I was on a conference call just before this one. We're talking to an organization that's going to do a 5-day-long virtual conference and a virtual trade show. It's a brave new world. In my state, they're running school buses around to certain areas of our state that don't have good connectivity and using them for hotspots. So it's really elevated the importance of contracts just like these. So let your chief procurement officer know. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if you don't know who your state chief procurement officer. Well, I'm going to tell you how. The web address naspo.org/states is on the NASPO website. NASPO is our parent organization. And if you go to that website, you will see a map of the nation. Just click on your state, and lo and behold, you will find the contact information for your state chief procurement officer. That's how.
Awesome. Thanks, Voight. So Jack, I think back to you, and I think we're open the floor for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And thank you, Voight, as well, for taking us through all of that. We definitely have time for questions if anyone has any. So if you have a question, please put it into the question box in the webinar platform, and we will be sure to get those answered. I have not seen any questions come through during the presentation, so we can just hold a few minutes to see if folks have any other ones.
So while we're waiting in silence, let me just throw some other things out at you. Obviously, technology has shifted and changed a lot since 2013 when we first deployed this contract in the state of Maine, and so pricing is different, devices are different, things like that. But to give you guys some context, the price that the state of Maine paid, for example, for a MacBook Air for each student at schools that wanted to do MacBook Airs, the total cost that they paid over the course of the 4 years of the contract of that deployment was less than the education list price of a MacBook Air. Right? So if you think about that, Apple has their standard education price offering. They put a number out there, and you know, if you're buying onesie twosies or even 50 or 100 from Apple, typically, you know, this is your price, and that's their standard education price. The price that we paid that included not only that device, but the warranty, the support, the software, the professional development for teachers, professional development for administrators, for technicians, the asset management, the repair services, the replacement devices, all of those pieces added up to less than the total, that number. So we were actually paying less money for the device than what the device costs on the list price, and we got all those associated services, which really, I think, underscores the notion of doing statewide contracts and doing things at scale. And remember, Maine is a tiny little state. You know, all told, the student population of the state of Maine in K-12 is roughly equivalent to Miami-Dade, and that's it, right? But when we act as states, it really puts a stake in the ground, and the vendors really wake up and they pay attention. So I see there's a question here from let's see, what technologies are available to expand internet to families at home that cannot afford internet or have limited access? So this particular contract did not contemplate connectivity because, of course, it was not written with the kind of the pandemic in mind. And so it does not address connectivity, although I would say, and I think Voight, you could probably jump in here, I know that there is a kind of quote unquote commodity connectivity contracts with NSPA Value Point that are not this one, but other ones, right?
Correct. Actually, our largest contract category is called wireless voice data and accessories. We have some of the largest contracts with the major carriers such as AT&T and Verizon in the world. So many contracts there. We just rebid this through the state of Utah. They added a great number of things such as hotspots. In fact, we've seen a great deal of activity from relative to school districts regarding hotspots in the recent months, as you might expect. So definitely other contracts with NSPA Value Point that could solve your connectivity issues.
And I'll add to that, one thing that is important to remember is that whatever the price point is that's published on those contracts, there's no procurement officer, whether they're the state level or the district level, who would refuse a lower price. And so just because the contract has a number on it doesn't mean that some districts can't get even better pricing, right? So some of your big city districts may scoff at some of the prices. Oh, I can do better. And maybe they can. But remember, by establishing these contracts, you do at least set a baseline. It's very similar to a couple of years ago, the state of New Jersey did some statewide bidding for broadband services for school buildings. And they ran it through one of their education service agencies, and they established some base pricing for northern New Jersey and southern New Jersey. And then after that, and those were better prices than what everyone was getting before because they did these statewide bids. Then after that, what happened was all the vendors that didn't win started undercutting the statewide contract price in order to get business, which just continued to drive the price down again. But what was key was that they first established the state contract so that there was something that everyone could see and say, well, if you can't at least match that price, you're not going to get any business. So having that baseline can be really useful, even if you have some districts who are gargantuan who say, hey, I can do better. Because the other reality is, as you all know, none of you really have more than 1 or 2 cities who can probably make that claim. Most of your districts have less than 5,000 kids and they don't have volume purchasing power. And so these things usually do help them a lot.
And I'll just add to, in support of what both Jeff and Boyd have said, I think while many states have probably considered state level aggregation and group purchasing for broadband services for state agencies and employees, now what we're seeing is school districts, and then by turn, like at the state level, they're starting to consider what group purchasing means for those internet services, and is that the right approach? And the early signs point to yes. North Dakota actually very successfully has already sort of engaged their service provider community statewide in more of a procurement style interaction about delivering connectivity services to the homes of students statewide. We've got a case study on that up on our Digital Bridge website. But I think, again, we're seeing more success with people that are taking that sort of an approach, as opposed to let's just try to shepherd our families to the low-cost carrier options, which we've heard are very difficult to navigate, kind of on a one-to-one level, on more of a vendor to the home level. The group purchasing really does have a lot of potential with connectivity as well.
All right, so we've got a couple more questions here in the Q&A. So I see one here that says, do you remember the total initial investment for Maine as a whole? So when the state of Maine started the program way back in 2002, we were spending approximately $9 million a year, and that was to outfit every 7th and 8th grade student, teacher, and every 7th and 8th grade school building with a Wi-Fi network. In the later years, of course, we started to grow the program, expand into other grades, and of course, things continue to shift. That initial contract was at $300 per pupil per year. The second contract we did 4 years later was down to $289. Is that right? Yeah, $289 per pupil. 3 years later, amidst the 2009 financial crisis, I went back to the negotiating table, recognizing that we were having a lot of problems, and of course, with great crises in education and bad financial times, the vendors realized that things might not go well for them either. And so I was actually able to then renegotiate the $289 down to $272. In fact, and then we got it down later to $242. And then in the final contract in 2013, it got as low on the iPad was $217 per year. I think at our peak kind of total expenses, of course, was up because the total headcount was up. And so in the last final years that I was in state offices, we were spending roughly $25 million a year, and that was to outfit all of the middle schools, all the high schools with Wi-Fi networks, all the high school teachers, and about 65% of high school students with devices, and a smattering of elementary schools. Today, every student in the state of Maine has a device from one source or another. There's another question. How are the technical specs updated as time goes on? How is the cost of deployment management applicable to different areas of the nation? So as far as the updating, this was typically the way we always dealt with it was the devices you deployed, we typically worked in 3 or 4 year life cycles. And so for those 3 or 4 years, you had those same pieces of equipment. During that time, of course, all software was updated. So part of the contract was software assurance. So you always had the latest version of the operating system, those kinds of things. But the hardware, of course, was the same hardware. One of the things that actually made life simpler for us was that we tried to always ship the exact same device. So if we shipped a 2013 era MacBook Air and 3 years later somebody drops one and we replace it with a 2013 era MacBook Air. And we were able to do that because we were such a large client of Apple's. But that also then meant that our repair center could easily stock parts because all the machines were identical. which also then kept costs down for them. And it also made it easier for them to predict what kind of parts do we need, because we know what seems to fail more often. How is the cost of deployment management applicable in different areas? I think we definitely saw, for example, of course, Hawaii got higher pricing when they came in as an initial partner in this first time we went to the RFP in 2013, because they're a multi-island state, and so transportation and other things like that definitely there's a cost to living in paradise, I guess. Other parts of the country, I think that the key is the equipment costs obviously don't really make a big difference, but the deployment pieces, I think it's a lot of it is going to have to do with scale and size, but I'm not sure. I couldn't really give you an apples to oranges comparison. Like I did see, and you can go if you visit that URL that Voight pointed out before, to look at the Nevada contracts. They then deployed Chromebooks, and Maine never did. So we can't really compare deployment costs between those two contracts because they were different devices. But I hope that helps a little bit. And then another question, could this be run through a state education department's procurement office and not the state's? I think, Voight, I would guess that would be up to the state procurement office. Is that correct?
Yes, Jeff, it would, because our members are the chief purchasing officials of the states. They would have to decide that. An education department in a state can typically award contracts for itself. Typically, it would take a chief procurement officer to award contracts for all districts within the state, for example. But I've worked very closely with the procurement office here in the state of South Carolina Department of Education. I knew them well, and we coordinated quite well with them, and I'm sure that happens the same way across the nation.
Okay. Well, we still do have a few more minutes. I don't see any more questions in the chat right now, but if you do have any questions, now's the time. We have a few seconds to see if there's any lingering questions. And I don't see anything
on the screen. Yeah, I was gonna say, on the screen you can see all of our email addresses, so if you want to jot those down, if questions do come up, please feel free to reach out to us.
Absolutely. And I will mention too that we are recording this webinar, so we will distribute the recording as well as posting it up on our website for anyone that wants to refer to it later. And I believe we also will plan to send out the slides to everyone that attended, so you'll have those. Okay, I don't see any new questions, Jeff, so I think we can wrap it up. I just want to say, one, thank you especially to our presenters, our experts, Jeff and Voight. Really appreciate your time on the webinar and providing all this valuable information. And I also want to say thank you to all of our attendees. I know especially if you're on the East Coast, we're getting late in the day, and for many of you who are part of CCSSO, you've been on a few webinars already today, so thanks for keeping your attention with us and being a part of our presentation.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Not sure how we stop on this thing.
Bye.
Who's driving this thing?
Guess I'm going to hit stop on the recording button. Does that sound like a good idea?
Actually tried to hit it right as you were saying it. Okay, and then